Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. In Chapter 3 of his work, Anarchy, State, and Utopia, Robert Nozick is going to devote some discussion to what he calls moral side constraints and the question of whether or not, and to what degree, they apply to non-human animals. Now, he's already elaborated how they do apply to the kind of animals that we human beings are. So he's thinking about the entire range of other kinds of animals. And he's going to begin his discussion by saying that we can illuminate the status and implication of moral side constraints by considering living beings for whom such stringent side constraints, or any at all, are usually not considered appropriate. So the kinds of restrictions, we could say moral restrictions on the use of human freedom that we acknowledge for human beings. I shouldn't do things that are going to hurt other people, let alone kill them. We might not view that necessarily as applying to all animals. And he doesn't go into examples, but, consider a few. So we are perfectly willing, typically, to say, you shouldn't act in such a way as to endanger the lives of animals that we typically view as pets, like dogs or cats. But we have no problem whatsoever generally destroying an insect colony that we feel is a pest around our house, or swatting a mosquito that's about to bite us. So there are at least some animals where we think, okay, we don't have to worry about what we do to them. There's no wrong being done in that. And so he's going to raise the question, well, are there any limits to what we may do to animals? Do they have the status, as some philosophers have said, of mere objects? Do some purposes fail to entitle us to impose great costs on animals? What entitles us to use animals at all, to reduce them to objects? And so he's going to consider first a scenario, and then he's going to say, let's jump into an argument. So the first scenario, he says animals do count for something. So it's difficult to prove this, but imagine this. If you felt like snapping your fingers, perhaps to the beat of some music, and you knew that by some strange causal connection, you snapping your fingers would cause 10,000 contented, unknown cows to die after great pain and suffering, or even painlessly and instantaneously, would it be okay for you to snap your fingers? Or would you feel that you have a moral obligation? There's a side constraint on you snapping your fingers, making use of your freedom to do so. I think most of us would say, well, in that scenario, I'm not going to snap my fingers. Why? Because it would be wrong to snuff out those 10,000 cows just because I want to snap my fingers. And he says, well, is there some reason it would be morally wrong to do so? So one argument that has been made by past thinkers is that there's nothing intrinsically morally wrong with doing something that harms or kills an animal, but engaging in that, as he says, brutalizes the human being that is so acting. And it's interesting he uses the word brutalize, because what does that actually mean? Reduces them to the level of the animal, to the brute, right? So he says these acts are morally unobjectionable in themselves, but they have what he calls an undesirable moral spillover. So the spillover would be onto fellow human beings. And he says, why should there be such a spillover? If it is in itself perfectly all right to do anything to animals for any reason whatsoever, then so long as you realize that there's a clear line between animals that are not human and animals that are human on both sides, then, and you keep it in mind as you act, then killing animals shouldn't brutalize a person and make them more likely to harm or kill persons. And the idea here is like, if you're torturing cats, then that's a step on the way to, say, torturing human beings, right? And he says, do we know that this is the case? Do butchers, for example, commit more murders than other people who have knives around? If I enjoy hitting a baseball with a bat, does this significantly increase the danger of me doing so to someone's head? Am I not capable of understanding people differ from baseballs? Doesn't this understanding stop the spillover? Why should things be different in the case of animals? Now, we could respond and say, well, it does seem that, there is a correlation between being abusive and murderous towards animals and doing so towards not just other animals, but human beings. And he says, well, that's an empirical question. And perhaps we could weigh in on that. And then he's going to move on. And he's going to say, listen, the question that we have to ask, and he won't fully address it in this section, is if some animals, not all animals, at least some animals count for something, we've got to answer these questions. Well, which animals do? Dogs and cats? Perhaps. Pigs? Well, what if you like bacon? Mosquitoes? Mollusks? How much do they count for? That's a question. Do they count as much as a human being? Do animals count different amounts based on the kind of animal they are? And most importantly, how can this be determined? How do we figure this out? We don't want to just come up with numbers out of the air or, go just by our guts or anything like that. How can we settle these sorts of matters? And he says, why don't we consider some cases? Now, two of them are things that happen pretty frequently, almost ubiquitously in the case of one, and then the third is a made-up case used to illustrate some of the problems with the second case. So the first case is humans eating animals for greater gustatory pleasure, as he's going to call it. That is, we get enjoyment out of, say, eating a steak or a pork chop or whatever else it's going to be. And it could be eating other things that are derived from animals as well. And think about factory farming as a way in which this happens. So he says, suppose, as I believe the evidence supports, eating animals is not actually necessary for health, not less expensive than alternate equally healthy diets available to people in the United States. So those are some big ifs right there. But, let's say that we grant them. The gain then from the eating of animals is pleasures of the palate, gustatory delights, varied tastes. And Nozick says, I'm not going to deny that these are actually pleasant, delightful, and interesting. The question is whether that extra pleasure for the human being justifies killing animals. Does it outweigh the moral weight to be given to animals' lives and pain? If we're going to count animals for something, is the extra gain obtained by eating them rather than non-animal products greater than the moral cost? How do we decide these things? So, he says, well, we might look at comparable cases, and then he talks about hunting. So, why do people hunt? Now, some people do hunt, in fact, to feed their families. And, we could actually say other animals hunt because they're obligate, what we call obligate carnivores. If you can give your cat some cat food, which is from meat products, right, from other animals. But if it's out in the wild, it's got to hunt, or it's not gonna live, and that means eating another animal. Do we have to do that? And he says, well, why do people currently, for the most part, hunt? Well, it's for the fun of it. And he says, I assume it's not all right to hunt and kill animals merely for the fun of it. Is hunting a special case because it's object, and what provides the fun is the chasing and maiming and death of animals? So then he says, well, let's think about another similar case. Suppose I enjoy swinging a baseball bat, but it happens that in front of the only place to swing it, it stands a cow. And swinging the bat would involve smashing the cow's head. I wouldn't get fun from smashing the cow's head. The pleasure comes from exercising my muscles, swinging well. It's an unfortunate side effect that the animal's skull gets smashed. And I could forego swinging the bat and bend down and touch my toes, but that wouldn't be as enjoyable as swinging the bat. I wouldn't get as much fun, pleasure, or delight about it. And then here's the question. Would it be all right for me to swing the bat in order to get the extra pleasure of swinging it as compared to the best alternative activity that doesn't involve harming an animal? And these are kind of similar situations, right? And he says these examples and these sorts of questions would help you to see what sort of line we want to draw, what sort of position we want to take, but they don't tell us once a conflict is shown which view to change. After failing to devise a principle to distinguish swinging the bat from killing and eating an animal, you might decide it's really all right after all this to swing a bat. Here's the point that he's making. Most of us would say, no, that's ridiculous, the swinging a bat. Don't do that, right? That's not okay. But most people seem to be pretty cool with eating animals. So, how do we compare and contrast these against each other? He's also going to bring up an additional argument that's of some interest. And he's going to say, this is one ubiquitous argument, not unconnected with side constraints. Because we human beings eat animals, human beings raise a lot more of those particular animals than would otherwise exist. So, think about cows. So long as people want to eat beef and eat, the meat of calves, veal, and we could also say in terms of dairy farming, wanting to have lots and lots of milk products, we're going to be raising more cows than would exist on their own because we're breeding them and feeding them. And ultimately, they're destined for feeding ourselves or perhaps feeding other animals. Maybe they get turned into dog food or cat food. But they exist for a while, and here's part of the argument. It's better to exist than not to exist, even if it's for a year, 2 years, 5 years. So maybe it's okay for us to do that, right? The animals are better off because we have the practice of eating them. And he says, now if tastes changed and people no longer found it enjoyable to eat animals, what would we do? Should we steel ourselves to continue eating them? And he says, I trust I shall not be understood as saying that animals are to be given the same moral weight as people if I note a parallel argument. What if we applied this to children? A given couple having reached a certain number of children that's been limited in advance proposes to have an additional child. So it's like everybody gets to have 2 kids. And they're like, we want to have a 3rd kid. And the government says, all right, but you're going to have to kill that kid, say when they turn 23 or something like that. And they could say, well, living 23 years is better than not living at all. So sure, let's make the kid, and then, we don't even have to kill the kid ourselves. Maybe the government will take care of that. And we would say, no, that's not a good reason, right? Why? So Nozick says once the person exists, they have certain claims that they can make to certain treatment, like don't kill me. So if we would say that about a human being, why wouldn't we think that that could also apply to an animal? He says once they exist, animals too may have claims to certain treatment. Now those claims may carry less weight than those of people, but the fact that some animals were brought into existence only because someone wanted to do something that would violate one of these claims doesn't show that the claim doesn't exist at all. So, if we're farming oysters, perhaps those claims are very, very small. But if we're farming cows or an even more intelligent animal, pigs, maybe there's some significant moral side constraints that should be placed there. So this is the first portion of Nozick's section here, moral side constraints in animals, where he's really setting up the problem for us and not giving us a solution as such.